What's the best dose of exogenous human-chorionic gonadotropin, you might ask? For the best libido, the best fertility parameters, the best metabolism, the biggest loads, and even increasing the length of your penis? If I didn't have your curiosity at first, I'm sure I have your undivided attention now. All shall be revealed after this short 3-second disclaimer. Vigorous Steve here. Welcome to the ultimate human-chorionic gonadotropin, better known as HCG Deep Dive, where we're going to look into all of the beneficial effects of HCG, whether you're running that solo as HCG monotherapy or alongside testosterone replacement therapy, hormone replacement therapy, or even full-blown steroid cycles. There are over 28,000 studies on PubMed about HCG, so if you feel I left out an important one, feel free to post a citation down below in the description section. I'm always willing to make a follow-up video if there's a lot more to discuss about HCG and particular unique characteristics that I might have overlooked in this video. Let's start this video by briefly explaining what human-chorionic gonadotropin actually is, what it does, and why it's important to run alongside your anabolic androgenic steroids, whether that's TRT, HRT, or full-blown steroid cycles. Whenever you take testosterone derivatives, or SARMs for that matter, even though I'm highly against SARMs, when you take testosterone derivatives, the hypothalamic to the pituitary testicular axis signaling is completely shut down. So you need to replace some of this signaling with human-chorionic gonadotropin to keep your testicles active. In normal male physiology, the hypothalamus secretes gonadotropin hormone-releasing hormone in response to serum sex hormones being testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, estrone, and estradiol, with estradiol providing the biggest negative feedback in GHRH secretion. The pituitary then secretes luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone, LH and FSH, in response to GHRH, gonadotropin hormone-releasing hormone, which can be further blunted by elevated sex hormones. LH and FSH travel down to the testicles as part of endocrine hormone signaling. Luteinizing hormone activates the combined luteinizing hormone chorionic gonadotropin receptor, the LHCG receptor, which initiates testosterone synthesis within the testicles, increasing intratesticular testosterone levels quite significantly. And follicle-stimulating hormone activates the FSH receptors, which in the presence of intratesticular testosterone initiates spermatogenesis. So in this normal HPTA functioning, luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone keeps your testicles working, and thus serum testosterone levels should be normal and semen parameters should be normal as well, until you take exogenous anabolic androgenic steroids, and then this whole system falls apart. When testosterone and estradiol are chronically elevated when you're on TRT or there above, that means that the hypothalamus no longer secretes gonadotropin hormone-releasing hormone, and the pituitary no longer secretes luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. But you're in luck. The LHCG receptor also responds to human-chorionic gonadotropin when administered through exogenous sources. HCG is barely detectable in men. It's mostly present in pregnant women, but it is bioidentical for men. So when you take it through exogenous routes, this HCG can activate the LHCG receptor and initiate testosterone synthesis within the testicles, which ultimately can contribute to spermatogenesis by also activating their Sertoli cells. So you keep your testicles somewhat active even in the absence of follicle-stimulating hormone, which you can also supplement with, but that's not what this video is about. That being said, fertility parameters will never be as good on HCG treatment unless you also have FSH in the picture, and whether that's coming from exogenous sources, injectable recombinant follicle-stimulating hormone, or using selective estrogen receptor modulators, Clomid and Clomiphene, etc., which I don't think are sustainable for the risk of blood clots, ocular changes, emotional disturbances, reduction in IGF-1 levels, etc. You have to keep your serum testosterone levels within normal parameters. Even if you blast HCG and FSH from exogenous sources, your fertility parameters will never be as good as coming off completely. But we'll save that for a separate video dropping in the near future. So long story short, too long didn't read. If you take steroids, your nuts will stop working. They'll shrink down to raisins unless you take HCG to keep them going and remain nice and full and juicy and grabbable while we're at it. So let's have a look into the medical applications of both urine-purified HCG and a more recently developed recombinant HCG to see what it's actually being used for. Urine-Purified HCG is being used in the treatment of prepubertal cryptorchidism in children aged 4 to 9 years old, which is not due to anatomical obstruction. Cryptorchidism is a condition where one or both of the testicles fail to descend from the abdomen into the scrotum, in which case the treatment is either 4,000 IUs intramuscularly 3 times weekly for 3 weeks, 5,000 IU intramuscularly every other day for 4 injections, 500 to 1,000 IUs intramuscularly every 3 days over 6 weeks for a total of 15 injections, or 500 IUs intramuscularly 3 times weekly for 4 to 6 weeks. So suppose the HCG treatment is highly at the discretion of the prescribing physician and what is needed to resolve the cryptorchidism in the prepubertal boys aged 4 to 9 years old. HCG, urine purified that is also being prescribed in adult male hypogonadotropic hypogonadism, where pituitary luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormones are basically undetectable or so low that testosterone production and spermatogenesis is basically completely arrested. HCG isn't used when the luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormones are within normal parameters, and then that could mean that there's a varicocele or some sort of structural issue where the LH and FSH are not getting to the testicles, or they're not responsive to LH and FSH, which also means that they wouldn't be responsive to HCG. In adult male hypogonadotropic hypogonadism, the treatment is as follows: 500 IUs to 1,000 IUs HCG intramuscularly 3 times per week for 3 weeks, or 4,000 IUs intramuscularly 3 times per week for 6 to 9 months, followed by 2,000 IUs intramuscularly 3 times per week for another 3 months. So there's a bit of a discrepancy here. Is it either 500 to 1,000 IUs 3 times per week for only 3 weeks to kind of assess the response, and if the response is good, then you escalate the dosage upwards to 4,000 IUs intramuscularly 3 times per week for up to 9 months, followed by half the dose, 2,000 IUs 3 times per week for another 3 months. And then that treatment would only last 12 months, 1 year in total. Maybe after that time, testosterone replacement therapy should be in the cards for this adult male suffering from hypogonadism, right? The scientific literature is a little bit thin. I don't think that HCG therapy is commonly prescribed, but there's a lot of scientific evidence comparing HCG monotherapy to aromatase inhibitors, to selective estrogen receptor modulators, and even testosterone replacement therapy, but we'll get into all of that a little bit later on in this video. And urine-purified Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin is also prescribed in adult female induction of ovulation, in which case the dose is between 5,000 to 10,000 IUs intramuscularly or subcutaneously, depending on response, if there's irritation at the injection site, following the last days of gonadotropin administration, which in many cases is follicle-stimulating hormone. Oh, and the medical inserts of urine-purified Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin clearly mentions that HCG doesn't help with fat loss or appetite management. So forget about your 500 calories, 500 IUs HCG fat diet. But lucky you, this isn't specifically mentioned in the Merck Ovitrel recombinant HCG inserts. So if you want to go with the fat diet, then you have to go with recombinant over urine purified. And these are the medical applications for recombinant human-chorionic gonadotropin. It's being used in the development of follicles in adult females, in which case the dose is 6,500 IUs or 250 micrograms, which is all described in the medical inserts. Subcutaneously, either that's daily or in single administration, it highly depends on the protocol that's required for egg retrieval needed for in vitro fertilization. And that's alongside selective estrogen receptor modulators like clomiphene citrate, for example, gonadotropins, follicle-stimulating hormone, and gonadotropin antagonists like triptorelin, later down right before egg retrieval to block further luteinizing hormone secretion. And recombinant HCG is also being used to induce ovulation in adult women, in which case the dose is exactly the same, 6,500 IUs subcutaneously, usually the day before expected, or planned ovulation, because it takes about 24 to 36 hours. And it's in cases of in vitro fertilization and egg retrieval following the last dose of gonadotropins, but it's only administered in a single administration without any gonadotropins when it's needed for intrauterine insemination. Now, I've undergone many a process of intrauterine insemination and egg retrieval needed for IVF with my wife because we're trying to conceive. The process is a little bit different every single time, or at least a combination of a recombinant human-chorionic gonadotropin, gonadotropins, and gonadotropin antagonists, even the use of selective estrogen receptor modulators and DHEA here and there. But I'll describe all of that in an upcoming fertility video on how to get your wife pregnant following the use of anabolic androgenic steroids, whether you undergo intrauterine insemination, in vitro fertilization, or regular good old practice in the bedroom at that. Recombinant HCG isn't used medically for adult male hypogonadotropic hypogonadism or androgen deficiency, but I can tell you firsthand that a sixth of a Merck Ovitrel recombinant HCG pen at 10,083 IUs subcutaneously 3 times weekly brought my serum testosterone levels up to about 850 nanograms per deciliter on average over almost a year period. So I would say that it works very favorably even after a decade of steroid use, and during this time my serum estradiol levels remained to the top of the reference range, so that's slightly higher compared to total testosterone when you go by the reference ranges. Still, I felt very, very good. Was it enough for my overall bodybuilding aspirations? Not entirely. That's why I'm back on testosterone replacement therapy and then some. And I've seen similar HCG protocols, whether that was with urine-purified or recombinant HCG, raise total testosterone levels to over 1,500 nanograms per deciliter simply because the detectable range only went up to 1,500 nanograms per deciliter. So maybe their total testosterone levels were significantly higher than that. In men aged, let's say, between mid-20s to mid-30 years old, who've never touched anabolic androgenic steroids before, but wanted to see if HCG monotherapy could bring their total testosterone levels from, let's say, the bottom to the middle of the reference range to super physiological levels, right, before they committed to hormone replacement therapy or similar protocols. And you can see that with 1,000 IUs HCG 3 times per week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the total testosterone levels increase between 2-fold to 5-fold, depending on how responsive their testicles are. Needless to say, many of these men remained with HCG monotherapy for several years until they felt the need to go on hormone replacement therapy and start experimenting with a couple compounds alongside of that. Now, keep in mind that many of these men also use an aromatase inhibitor because 1,000 IUs HCG 3 times per week will raise your serum estradiol levels, obviously, when total testosterone levels are maxed out on the detectable range over 1,500 nanograms per deciliter. So you need to put some sort of aromatase inhibition in place, and whether that's coming from a medically used aromatase inhibitor or an over-the-counter supplement or another ancillary that are known to lower serum estradiol levels, I'll leave that entirely up to you. I have several videos about this topic, which you can watch when you're done with this one. And please be forewarned, HCG monotherapy might moon serum estradiol levels in certain individuals, more so comparative to testosterone replacement therapy if we're aiming for similar total testosterone levels on blood work results. So if you're aiming for 1,000 nanograms per deciliter or 1,500 nanograms per deciliter, you might have more estradiol with HCG monotherapy compared to testosterone replacement therapy. If we're going with daily subcutaneous microadministrations, you might end up at 150 picograms per milliliter serum estradiol on HCG monotherapy and only 50 picograms per milliliter with TRT. So keep this in mind going forward. Again, the administration routes and the injection frequency is going to be a little bit different. It highly depends on your body fat levels and the individual aromatase expression and activity within your testicles. But obviously, if you combine TRT with a low dose, a sustainable dose of HCG without an aromatase inhibitor, your serum estradiol levels might still be going to the moon. So all of this you need to keep in mind if you start stacking these compounds together. Although weirdly, the scientific evidence comparing TRT to HCG monotherapy reports that this is not the case. But don't worry, we'll get into all of that a little bit later on. Now, you might wonder, what is the difference between urine-purified HCG and recombinant HCG, and which of these two do I need to go with if I want to use HCG monotherapy or HCG alongside my TRT, HRT, or full-blown steroid cycles? Don't worry, I did all of the research for you. Let's start comparing. Urine-purified HCG, as the name implies, is made from the urine of pregnant women. The more you know, right? And this is actually a job for many pregnant women during the first trimester, in which case urinary HCG excretion is so freaking high. They collect all of their urine, they send this off to a pharmaceutical facility where the HCG is extracted and lyophilized into a puck, which you can then later reconstitute and inject. Now, there's not 100% purity in this instance. There might be some contamination peptides present in this urine-purified HCG, but we'll get into that. So now that you know, I don't know what's nastier, injecting purified peptides coming from the urine of pregnant women or injecting purified peptides coming from pig brains in the form of cerebrolysin. Well, at least we don't have to go with cadaver GH anymore. And it brings us to recombinant HCG, which is made with recombinant DNA technology using either Chinese hamster ovary cells or human embryonic kidney cells, resulting in the highest purity you could possibly get from any pharmaceutical HCG formulation. The purity of urine-purified HCG is between 80 to 98.2%, but with recombinant HCG, that's very comparable to recombinant human growth hormone, the purity is over 99.7%. There's actually a huge discrepancy in the potency and purity of pharmaceutical urine-purified HCG brands, which is well documented in the scientific literature, citations down below. Ever since HCG was labeled as a biological by the Biden administration, the quality, the purity, the potency of both pharmaceutical and generic and even compounded HCG has taken a nosedive, and it's getting increasingly harder to find high quality, high potency, high purity urine-purified HCG on the market, whether that's from online sources or on prescription. So for this reason alone, I would highly recommend you just to stick with recombinant HCG if you can find it. Regarding the injection depot, urine-purified HCG is usually administered intramuscularly, albeit in some instances, usually when the purity is low and there's some skin irritation, it's administered subcutaneously, but with recombinant HCG, it's always administered subcutaneously. And there is some scientific evidence that subcutaneous administrations of 5,000 IUs urine-purified HCG is as effective as intramuscular administrations when it comes to steroidogenesis within the testicles or to induce ovulation in women. The injection site complications with urine-purified, that is allergic reactions and irritation at the injection sites, and with the recombinant HCG, there are none, right? I've used so much recombinant HCG over the last year, well, actually over the last 2 years, as has my wife used many administrations of recombinant HCG. Smooth as butter, just as smooth as cerebrolysin administration, but those are purified peptides coming from pig brains, and this is made with recombinant DNA technology. So these injections are super smooth, similar to recombinant human growth hormone administrations. The half-life of urine-purified HCG through intramuscular administrations is between 24 to 33 hours, and with recombinant HCG through subcutaneous administrations, the half-life is between 32 to 33 hours. The clinical dosage and the ovulation rate in women for urine-purified HCG, that's 1,000 IUs intramuscularly, resulting in an 88% ovulation rate, and recombinant HCG, that's 6,500 IUs subcutaneously, resulting in a 95.3% ovulation rate. Now, they say that this is clinically insignificant, but a lower dose of recombinant HCG results in higher ovulation rates, so I would say that it's more effective. And again, this is probably stemming from the impurities, because if the urine-purified HCG is only 80% pure and the rest is some sort of trace peptides or other impurities, then obviously it's not going to be as effective and you need a higher dose. Keep this in mind when you start sourcing between urine-purified or recombinant HCG. Let's finally have a look at all of the beneficial, evidence-based, unique characteristics of human-chorionic gonadotropin, whether that's from urine-purified or recombinant sources. I limited the scope of this literature review to interesting factoids that we're going to be interested in within the fitness community, whether it resolves androgen deficiency, if it sustains testicular function on cycle, if it has potential performance-enhancing benefits or cognitive-enhancing benefits. Again, 28,000 studies. Forgive me if I forgot one of them. You can put your citations down below in case you want an addendum video to this one. Human-chorionic gonadotropin, evidence-based, unique characteristics. It increases intertesticular testosterone levels in a dose-dependent fashion, but it increases serum testosterone levels with diminishing returns as dose escalates upwards. We'll get into that a little bit later on. Relief symptoms of androgen deficiency in men. improves fertility parameters in androgen-deficient men. And in cases of androgen and estrogen deficiency, HCG monotherapy provides anti-aging effects, improves mood and sense of well-being, resolves symptoms of depression, and resolves symptoms of cognitive decline, mostly in the elderly, and improves bone mineral density also in the elderly. Again, if your testosterone and estrogen levels are sufficient, HCG monotherapy is not going to have these beneficial effects, or these beneficial effects if you run that alongside testosterone replacement therapy or anything there above. But in the context of having androgen and estrogen deficiency, HCG monotherapy is going to be extremely beneficial. HCG sustains testicular function and fertility parameters during anabolic androgenic steroid or selective androgen receptor modulator usage or abuse, but it's less effective when 19 testosterone derivatives are used. We'll get into this a little bit later on. HCG fully or partially recovers testicular function and fertility parameters after steroid or SARM usage or abuse, but that's usually alongside the recombinant follicle-stimulating hormone, selective estrogen receptor modulators like Clomid or enclomiphene, or aromatase inhibitors like anastrozole or exemestane, right? You don't only use HCG to recover fertility parameters and testicular function. It's usually part of a post-cycle therapy, in which case many fertility medications are used. HCG might improve metabolism by interacting with the thyroid-stimulating hormone receptors, stemming from humans and animal models, but this is generally not observed with exogenous HCG because exogenous HCG usage doesn't really reach the serum concentrations needed to boost metabolism. In pregnant women during the first trimester, you see that HCG levels are sky-freaking high, in which case it increases thyroxine and triiodothyronine levels to improve metabolism. So don't think that you can take HCG to boost your metabolism. There's no additional fat loss by taking HCG directly, but indirectly it might still boost metabolism if serum testosterone levels and serum estradiol levels go up. Right? Keep this in mind. Metabolism might still go up, but thyroid function and thyroid panel blood work results not going to change. I've never seen this play out in the real world. Before HCG treatment, up to 1,000 IUs 3 times per week, and afterwards, thyroid stimulating hormone levels don't really budge. Total and free T3 levels don't really budge. Total and free T4 levels don't really budge. Don't use this to boost metabolism. If you want to boost metabolism, do some extra cardio and use some fat burners, right? Thyroid stimulating hormone interaction is only going to occur when you're pregnant in the first trimester and serum HCG levels are freaking high. This is why they purify the urine of pregnant women during the first trimester, because there's so much HCG present. And it's also evident in the scientific literature that HCG is linked to thyroid cancers in human subjects in many case studies. But this is only observed during pregnancies or multitude consecutive pregnancies or pituitary adenomas, again, in which case HCG levels in serum are sky-freaking high. And apparently, HCG increases penile length between 3 to 8% stemming from animal models. Let's just get right into that study, shall we? Performed by Lee et al., published on October 2nd, 2023, very, very recent, titled Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin Supplement Did Not Accelerate Tenuca-albuginea Remodeling to Facilitate Penile Growth, but we'll be the judge of that. In this study, 4-week-old immature pubertal Sprague-Dawley rats received 100 IUs HCG per 1 kilogram of body weight intramuscularly 3 times weekly, solo or in combination with a stretching procedure to lengthen the penis, similar to vacuum penis pumping, bathmate style. The treatments lasted for 4 weeks, finishing around the time that the rats reached sexual maturity. HCG treatment alone increased penis length by 8%, but HCG plus stretching lengthened the penis by 10%, so that's promising and probably worth the extra effort. Oh, and if you're wondering what the anti-lock stands for, showing an increase of 26%, it's basically the inhibition of lysyl oxidase, which decreases the rate of collagen and elastin cross-linking systemically. So now you're compromising skeletal muscle, connective tissue, as well as the structural integrity of your penis. So don't even think about it, buddy. In the conclusion, the researchers mentioned that HCG treatment lengthened the penis by increasing serum sex hormone levels, which have clearly been linked to the size of the penis and the length of the penis in developing human males as well, albeit that they mentioned that the vacuum treatment did not have a synergistic effect. But I would say that an increase from 8 to 10% is well worth the effort. Will you gain an inch or an inch and a quarter, right? The difference between 8 to 10% is 25% more. And this extra quarter inch could be the world of difference. Now, the problem is that you need to undergo a protocol like this with HCG treatment and penis pumping before you hit puberty, similar to height protocols, which you also need to do before you hit puberty. So for all of us watching right now, it's simply too late. And if you're, young and you haven't undergone puberty yet, then you shouldn't be watching this video. Please watch it when you're of at least 21 years old. And in the meantime, just go watch the Disney Channel instead. And I'm sure there's a lot more unique characteristics about human-chorionic gonadotropin, but with so many studies on this compound, many of which have been performed in the context of pregnancy, I simply wasn't able to scan through all of them. So if you feel I left something out, post your citations down below and I'll get to work for a follow-up video. I briefly want to compare HCG monotherapy to testosterone replacement therapy so you know what the differences are if you're looking for viable options to increase your total testosterone levels to the top of the reference range. Here's one paper that I want to highlight that I think everybody should read after you're done watching this video, obviously, because Brad Schoenfield contributed to it, and he's one of the greatest researchers that we have in our fitness community. Performed by Fink and Schoenfield et al., published in January 2021, titled Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin Treatment, a Viable Option for Management of Secondary Hypogonadism and Male Infertility. This paper basically goes over all of the scientific evidence regarding the use of human-chorionic gonadotropin in the management of secondary hypogonadism and male infertility, but it also compares the effects of HCG to TRT. So it's a great read if you're still on the fence between deciding HCG monotherapy or going along with TRT and then reintroducing HCG a little bit later on. And this study performed by Rahim et al., published on July 2021, titled Efficacy of Non-Testosterone-Based Treatment in Hypogonadal Men, a review, which is another review paper that goes over non-testosterone-based treatments in hypogonadal men, whether that's HCG monotherapy, aromatase inhibitors, or the use of selective estrogen receptor modulators like Clomid or enclomiphene. Another study, which is an important read, performed by La Vignera et al., published in 2016, titled Late Onset Hypogonadism, the Advantages of Treatments with Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin Rather Than Testosterone. In this study, they showed a difference in blood work parameters when 2000 IUs urine-purified HCG is administered 2 times weekly, intramuscularly, and is compared to various testosterone replacement therapy protocols, whether that's Libido, Testosterone, or testosterone cream. Just keep in mind that the subjects were all androgen-deficient men aged between 45 to 53 years old, with terrible baseline lipid parameters at the start of the study before HCG treatment was started, so some of the changes might not play out if you're otherwise healthy. And when we look at the results of this study, comparing 4 different treatments to resolve androgen deficiency in elderly men, comparing the baseline blood work parameters to the blood work results taken after 6 months of treatment, you see that the hormonal parameters at baseline, a total testosterone was between, let's say, 150 to 200 nanograms per deciliter. Here in this study, they mentioned nanograms per milliliter, so that's 1.98 nanograms per milliliter at the baseline of the Gonasi HCG group. And then after 6 months of treatment, total testosterone levels increased by 120 nanograms per deciliter from, let's say, 200 nanograms per deciliter to 320 nanograms per deciliter, which isn't much of a significant change, I would say. But again, these men are androgen deficient and might not be very responsive to the HCG that they were administered. And in the testosterone cream group, they went from 160 to, let's say, 250 nanograms per deciliter. In the Libido group, from 165 to 325 nanograms per deciliter. And in the testosterone group, from 155 to 285 nanograms per deciliter. So they all ended up around 300 nanograms per deciliter, which is very comparable. Luteinizing hormone in all groups was around 2 milli-IUs per milliliter, same for follicle-stimulating hormone. And after the treatments, they all decreased except for the testosterone cream group. You see that luteinizing hormone decreased by about 1 milli-IUs per milliliter, and follicle-stimulating hormone decreased a little bit less, only by 0.2 milli-IUs per milliliter in all groups. But weirdly, in the testosterone cream group, luteinizing hormone actually increased from 2 milli-IUs per milliliter to 2.6 milli-IUs per milliliter. Serum estradiol was around 20 to 30 picograms per milliliter, 25 picograms per milliliter in the Gonadotropin HCG group. It increased by only 1 picograms per milliliter, whereas in the other groups you see a significant increase between 4 to 10 picograms per milliliter. So they ended up between 30 to 38 picograms per milliliter, which is at the top of the reference range. Interestingly, vitamin D levels increased quite significantly in the Gonadotropin HCG group. At baseline, it was 12, and I'm not entirely sure if that's nanomoles per liter or nanograms per milliliter, because this study doesn't include the concentrations or the reference ranges, so we're going to have to guesstimate here. At baseline, it was 12, and it increased by 22 points to 34 nanomoles per liter or nanograms per milliliter. So long story short, the testosterone levels went up. Suppression of luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone is quite comparable to testosterone treatments, but estradiol levels didn't increase as much as the testosterone treatments. Again, we can mitigate that with aromatase inhibitors. And weirdly, they checked thyroid-stimulating hormone levels at the baseline of this study, but didn't recheck that after 6 months of treatment. So now we're still not sure if HCG, at least in the context of androgen deficiency in elderly men, interacts with the TSH receptors, increases T4 and T3 concentrations, and ultimately reduces thyroid-stimulating hormone levels in serum over time. At baseline in the Gonadotropin HCG group, thyroid-stimulating hormone levels were 1.9 milliIUs per milliliter. So let's say after 6 months of treatment, there were non-significant findings, and TSH levels were still around 1.9 milliIUs per milliliter, but we're just guesstimating here because the results haven't been published. Moving over to the anthropometric and metabolic parameters, you see that fasting insulin levels were the highest in the HCG group at 20 milliIUs per liter, and they also dropped the most by 10 milliIUs per liter after 6 months of treatment. But basically, after 6 months of treatment, all fasting insulin levels were very comparable, so I would say that that's a non-significant result. And keep in mind that these elderly men with androgen deficiency had terrible blood work parameters at the start of this study. The HOMA score, which stands for Homeostatic Model Assessments for Insulin Resistance, a significant drop in the HCG group by 2.3 points from 4.3 to 2, basically. So that's a reduction of over 50%, which is significantly more than the testosterone groups. Total cholesterol levels saw a significant reduction amongst all groups. In the Gonadotropin HCG group, at baseline, total cholesterol was 200 milligrams per deciliter, reduced by 20 points down to 180 milligrams per deciliter, so that's a reduction of 10%. In the testosterone cream group, it only reduced by 10 points from 245 to 235 milligrams per deciliter. In the Libido group, a significant reduction by 30 points from 250 to 220 milligrams per deciliter. And the biggest reduction was in the testosterone group from 188 at baseline, a reduction of 45 points to, let's say, 140 milligrams per deciliter. So if you want to reduce your total cholesterol levels and you're androgen deficient in the elderly states, then testosterone wins hands down. HDL was pretty comparable at baseline, around 40 milligrams per deciliter. In the HCG group, it increased by 3 points from 37 to 40 milligrams per deciliter, and it increased the most in the Libido group by 5.5 points from 40 to 45.5 milligrams per deciliter. So in this context, to raise your HDL, Libido wins. Serum triglycerides were honestly terrible amongst all groups, between 200 to 255 milligrams per deciliter. I mean, any athlete would cringe at these numbers, but apparently that's the norm if you're androgen deficient and old. The maximum reduction was 50 points in the testosterone group from 233 to, let's say, 183 milligrams per deciliter, but that's still too fucking high. In the HCG group, it went from 230 to 200, give or take, milligrams per deciliter, which again is way too high. So please, these subjects needed to do some fasted cardio and inject some carnitine. Total body weight, waist circumference, lean mass, and fat mass saw small changes of, let's say, 1, 2, or 3 points either up or down. So I would say that that's non-significant. A testosterone replacement therapy or HCG monotherapy, I would say, is a poor method to control your body weight. You need to do some cardio, right? As we see in the serum triglyceride levels, none of the subjects did cardio on a daily basis. Otherwise, their serum triglyceride levels would be way better than they are here. And that would ultimately result in fat loss, a maintenance of lean mass, and a significant reduction in fat mass. And thus, waist circumference would come down also. But this is all non-significant changes. But when we look at the sperm parameters, you see that semen parameters are pretty much sustained on HCG monotherapy. So that's a small increase in density, progressive motility, normal forms, ejaculation forms, and leukocytes went down slightly. And when we compare that to the testosterone group, so whether that's cream or injectable, you see a significant reduction in semen parameters. Sperm density decreased between 17 to 22 points. Progressive motility decreased between 7 to 13 points. And normal morphology decreased, let's say, 3 to 4 points. Well, at least ejaculation volume stayed pretty much the same. And when we look at the safety parameters, you see a non-significant increase in hematocrit in the Gonasi HCG group. At baseline, hematocrit was 40%, increased by 1 point to 41%. I would say that that's pretty much identical, maybe a difference in hydration levels. But in the Libido group, at baseline, hematocrit was 38%, increased by 10 points to 48%. And with the testosterone group, it was 40 at baseline, increased by 8 points, also 48% after 6 months of treatment. And this is to be expected when you take injectable testosterone. Hematocrit over time does shoot up. So if this is what you're after, then I would say you should stick with injectable testosterone over HCG monotherapy, right, for performance-enhancing benefits. Prostate volume. You see at baseline was pretty much between 22 to 28 cubic centimeters. And after 6 months of treatment, it only increased by 5 cubic centimeters in the Gonasi HCG group. But when you look at the testosterone groups, whether that's cream or injectable, it increased by over 50% between 12 to 15 cubic centimeters. So that's quite a significant increase in prostate volume. And when we look at the prostate-specific antigen results, you see a non-significant increase in the Gonasi HCG group of only 0.1 nanograms per milliliter. And in the testosterone groups, whether that's cream or injectable, there is more of an increase between 0.4 to 0.8 nanograms per milliliter. But since at baseline PSH levels were between 0.2 to 0.8 nanograms per milliliter amongst all groups, I would say that even after 6 months of treatment, PSH levels are well below the cutoff of 4 nanograms per milliliter. So all subjects were considered to be healthy, right, regarding their prostate, not regarding their serum triglyceride levels. And regarding the questionnaires, that's so ambiguous, so let's just skip over that. So these are the comparison between HCG monotherapy and various testosterone treatments. A very interesting study. If you're still on the fence, give this study a read so you can make a better decision on which route of testosterone treatment or HCG treatment you're going to go to bring your total testosterone levels up to, let's say, middle, top of the reference range, depending on how low or high your total testosterone levels are currently and how much of an effect that might have on your blood work parameters and your overall state of health. There are 2 high-dose studies I want to highlight. Both are a little bit old and both are performed by Matsumoto et al. The first study was published in April 1983, titled Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin and Testicular Function, Stimulation of Testosterone, Testosterone Precursors, and Sperm Production Despite High Estradiol Levels. In this study, 5 healthy men aged between 25 to 40 years old with normal hormone and fertility parameters determined over a 3-month control period received 200 milligrams testosterone enanthate intramuscularly weekly for 3 to 5 months until 3 consecutive semen analysis results showed that sperm concentrations were below 5 million sperm per 1 milliliter. Once clinical subfertility was accomplished, the men continued with the exact same testosterone enanthate protocol, 200 milligrams weekly, and received on top of that 5,000 IUs, urine-purified human-chorionic gonadotropin 3 times weekly. I accidentally the entire vial 3 times a week, so that's 15,000 IUs HCG over the week in total, for another 4 to 6 months. My balls are on fire just thinking about it. Until semen parameters returned to their individual baseline readings. Once semen parameters were restored, testosterone enanthate and HCG was discontinued. However, one man continued with the exact same HCG protocol for another 6 months. 5,000 IUs 3 times per week. But we'll discuss those results a little bit later on. Throughout the entirety of the various study periods, the researchers interviewed the participants regarding their general health and sexual functioning and monitored their hormone levels and semen parameters. This is one hell of a study. Yeah, if you want to read a study about megadosing HCG, this is the one to read. So what can you expect from a moderate 200 milligram test E TRT dose and blasting enough HCG to make your MILF neighbor ovulate just by looking at you? A measly extra 51 nanograms per deciliter on your total testosterone levels comparing TRT solo to TRT plus HCG, but a whopping extra total of 84 picograms per milliliter of estradiol, which was already 74 picograms per milliliter on TRT solo. So yes, that's 158 picograms per milliliter, not picomoles per liter, picograms per milliliter. And surprisingly, none of these 5 subjects developed gynecomastia, but maybe that's because sex hormone binding globulin levels increased quite significantly during HCG treatment as well. Even after stopping testosterone enanthate, the men who continued with HCG treatment, serum estradiol still remained at superphysiological levels throughout the entire 6 months, with an average reading of 134 picograms per milliliter, which is almost 8 times higher than his control period, where serum estradiol was only 17 picograms per milliliter. Weirdly, his testosterone levels only increased from 470 nanograms per deciliter to 800 nanograms per deciliter, still significant increase, but it's a 1.7 times that of the control period. So testosterone goes up on this protocol, 5,000 IUs HCG 3 times per week. Testosterone goes up 1.7 times, but estradiol goes up 8 times. Maybe all the more incentive to not blast this much HCG unless you're doing it over a multitude of different months. So does this mean that there are diminishing returns with HCG administrations as the dose escalates upwards, but you just get more estradiol in comparison to testosterone when you're ramping up the dose? I have a study proving exactly that, but we'll get into that study a little bit later on. Other hormone parameters also saw a significant increase similar to testosterone and estradiol levels, but if you're interested, just follow the citations down below. Funnily enough, the only reported side effect was acne throughout this treatment, so I suppose 5,000 IUs HCG 3 times per week is perfectly safe, but still, I wouldn't recommend it. And there's one follow-up study also performed by Matsumoto et al., published on May-June 1985, so that's still fucking old, titled Stimulation of Sperm Production by Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin After Prolonged Gonadotropin Suppression in Men. In this study, 4 healthy men aged between 26 to 35 years old with normal hormone and fertility parameters determined over a 3-month control period also received 200 milligrams testosterone enanthate intramuscularly weekly for 9 months this time. Once clinical subfertility was accomplished over 6 consecutive months, so that's a very long time to be clinically subfertile, but not unheard of in the fitness community of men not using HCG alongside their TRT, HRT, or steroid cycles. The men continued with the exact same testosterone enanthate protocol and received another 5,000 IUs urine-purified HCG 3 times weekly, 15,000 IUs per week in total for another 6 months until normal spermia was achieved. One subject stopped HCG and continued with testosterone enanthate treatment and achieved clinical subfertility again a few months later. And if you scroll down to figure 1, it basically tells you everything that you need to know. After 9 months of exogenous testosterone and 6 months of clinical subfertility, 5,000 IUs HCG 3 times weekly is able to restore fertility parameters to the minimal levels as determined by the World Health Organization at that time, but not anywhere close to baseline. One subject developed obstructive sleep apnea, but the other subjects remained healthy and didn't experience any adverse effects, either during testosterone enanthate or testosterone enanthate plus HCG treatment. Blood work parameters remained comparable to baseline. Nobody developed gynecomastia, even though serum estradiol levels ended up sky high at an average of 153 picograms per milliliter, as seen in the other study. So long story short, too long didn't read. 5,000 IUs urine-purified HCG 3 times weekly over a 6-month period is reasonably well tolerated, with the only reported side effect being acne. Gynecomastia doesn't really seem to form, even though it moons serum estradiol levels to Star Wars destroying ranges. There, I said it. And it doesn't cause any desensitization as well, because total testosterone, estradiol levels, and semen parameters seem to steadily improve over the 6-month period that you're taking 3 fucking vials of HCG per week. But at least it proves that it also recovers semen parameters after long-term HPTA suppression, at least to normal spermia levels after TRT treatment, right? I'm not entirely sure if you would get the same results if you were blasting gear and blasting HCG. I can't imagine what your serum estradiol levels would be like unless you run aromatase inhibitors, but these results at least give us hope. Personally, I think that 1,000 IUs recombinant HCG 3 times weekly is more than sufficient to recover fertility parameters to normal spermia or even superspermia levels, which is what I got after over a year on 1,000 IUs recombinant HCG 3 times weekly. But most studies investigate 1,500 to 3,000 IUs HCG, whether that's urine purified or recombinant, 3 times weekly. So the scientific evidence and my personal practical applications helping many guys get their wives pregnant after long-term anabolic androgenic steroid use and abuse, blasting gear into the multiple grams. 1,000 IUs HCG 3 times per week, in my opinion, more than sufficient, right? But you can go with the scientific evidence and blast 5,000 IUs instead. Unfortunately, yet again, none of these high-dose studies keep track of thyroid parameters, which would have been nice because 5,000 IUs HCG, even though it's only once, is the ovulating dose, but none of that tracking occurs. So we're still not sure if such high of a dose interacts with the thyroid-stimulating hormone receptor, increases T4 and T3 levels in serum, reduces thyroid-stimulating hormone levels in serum, boosting overall metabolism. Couldn't find any of that in the scientific evidence, so maybe let's just put it to rest. In animal studies, yes. If you're pregnant, yes, it does boost metabolism, but if you're taking a moderate dose of HCG, whether that's recombinant or urine purified, to sustain testicular function, alongside TRT, HRT, or steroid cycles, I don't think that your metabolism is going to be impacted in any way, shape, or form. And again, in these high-dose studies, there are no clear signs of desensitization, as HCG is clearly shown to work for months on end, even at incredibly high dosages, running a TRT alongside of it. So why do some men notice that their HCG stops working over time? Besides the denaturing, which occurs after 2 weeks of reconstitution using bacteriostatic water, but shorter if you use sterile water or normal saline solution, if you transfer 250 IUs to 500 IU servings into insulin syringes, you might be able to freeze your HCG and thaw it when you need it. But we'll get into that a little bit later on in this video, or simply stick with recombinant HCG, which is presented in pens or syringes, which are self-sealing. So every time you administer a certain dose, no air with contaminants or pollutants can end up in the HCG solution, which isn't the case with urine-purified HCG, which you need to reconstitute yourself by removing the vacuum, then administering the bacteriostatic water inside for the lyophilized puck to dissolve. And then you can draw out all of the air containing possible pollutants, which will denature the HCG over time, which might prolong the active life of the HCG, albeit that it's not 100% foolproof, right? There's several ways around it, but freezing HCG or sticking with recombinant HCG is probably the best way to make sure that your HCG doesn't denature over time and lose effectiveness. Or you can simply reconstitute a new vial every 2 weeks with bacteriostatic water and discard the old one, although it will get very pricey very fast. Anecdotally, men using higher dosages of progestogenic 19 or testosterone derivatives, let's say 100 milligrams to 200 milligrams nandrolone weekly, or 50 milligrams or thereabove trembolone or tristolone weekly, notice initially that after introducing HCG to their protocol at, let's say, 250 IUs to 500 IUs 3 times weekly, that their testicular volume improves, their libido increases, their sense of well-being increases, and their semen volume also improves, whereas before it was basically so little that it looked like the penis was crying, like a couple drips, and that's the end of it, even though orgasm quality might be sky-fucking high, especially the case with trembolone. And then after a while, with long-term use, it appears that the HCG stops working. Your testicles shrink. Your semen volume comes down to the point it looks like you're shooting dust, maybe even less than before, and your libido takes a turn for the worst. Now, I already discussed all of this at length in several previous videos. I'll link them at the end of this one. Basically, I'll teach you how to keep your balls full and your loads massive. To keep it simple and explain why this downregulation might occur, progesterone plays a key role in testicular function and spermatogenesis, but these effects aren't observed with progestogenic 19 or testosterone derivatives that also activate the progesterone receptors on the testicles in place of bioidentical progesterone. And because these progestogenic 19 or testosterone derivatives, nandrolone, trembolone, and tristolone, have relatively high binding affinity, it might mean that they're blocking the effects of progesterone, and thus testicular function and spermatogenesis is impaired. And thus do they prevent a cascade of signals which would otherwise be responsive to luteinizing hormone or human-chorionic gonadotropin when they activate the combined LHCG receptor by reducing G-coupled protein signaling downstream. That's unclear. Or maybe they reduce the amount of LHCG receptors on the cell membrane of the Leydig cells, and now it doesn't matter how much HCG or LH you throw at it, there's not enough receptors to signal downwards for the increase of intratesticular testosterone and spermatogenesis downstream. Unfortunately, that's unclear. I couldn't find any scientific evidence to back this up or explain this in a certain sense, but if we go by basic human biology, it might be through the blockade of the progesterone receptor and some sort of downregulation of signaling which occurs within the Leydig cells. So basically, if you want your HCG to work as expected, don't take progestogenic 19-or testosterone derivatives at higher dosages, or reconstitute a new vial every 2 weeks, or stick with recombinant HCG, which is the one I prefer. Of course, this video wouldn't be complete without some evidence-based detection times, but now that the founders of the enhanced games went on Joe Rogan and they're getting more and more and more exposure, I don't think you're going to have to worry about the IOC, WADA, or USADA for that much longer, and the alternative is going to be bigger and badder than anything that came before. Still, the evidence-based detection times is what we're going to discuss. The half-life of urine-purified HCG, as mentioned before, is between 24 to 33 hours, and recombinant HCG subcutaneously has a half-life between 32 to 33 hours. There is a metabolite cutoff enforced by WADA because human-chorionic gonadotropin is bioidentical in both men and women, albeit that in women, serum levels are slightly higher than in men. So the urinary human-chorionic gonadotropin cutoff is below 5 IUs per liter or 5 milli-IUs per milliliter, and whether you achieve that with endogenous production, urine-purified HCG, or recombinant HCG, there might be a way to bypass detection. Here you see that 5,000 IUs urine-purified HCG intramuscularly is detectable for up to 7 days, but subcutaneous detectable for up to 8 days. 10,000 IUs urine-purified HCG intramuscularly is between 9 to 11 days. 30,000 IUs urine-purified HCG intramuscularly is over 9 days because the study didn't last any longer. 6,500 IUs recombinant HCG subcutaneously, also over 9 days, but another study showed that it was detectable up to 11 days. And 19,500 IUs recombinant HCG, so that's 3 pence of Merck Ovitrel subcutaneously. I mean, how many people would ovulate from that? I'm not entirely sure, but it's detectable over 9 days, again, because the study didn't last any longer. And all of these detection times are based on single administrations, whether that's intramuscularly or subcutaneously. For a multitude of different administrations, 2,000 IUs urine-purified HCG intramuscularly 3 times every 2 days, so that's 6,000 IUs in total, that was detectable 12 days. So based on all of these detection times, I would say that 11 to 12 days is playing it safe, and the masking agent appears to be biotin. If you're interested, citations are down below. There's one detection time study that I want to highlight, performed by Lunt et al., published on March 2015, titled Comparison of Newly Developed Immunomass Spectrometry Methods with Existing Delphia Immunoassay for Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin Detection in Doping Analysis. This is an interesting comparative study that looks at different HCG detection methods, comparing the results of all previously performed human volunteer excretion studies, and here you can clearly see that HCG levels fall below 5 IUs per liter or 5 milli-IUs per milliliter. Detection limit around 9 days with sensitive mass spectrometry testing, and HCG falls down to baseline levels around day 14. So this is a very interesting graph that we can all follow in case you want to beat the drug test while using HCG. I would say that the reported detection times of urine-purified or recombinant HCG through intramuscular administration is between 10 to 14 days, and with subcutaneous administration, that's 11 to 14 days. So I would do 14 days just to play it safe if you're subject to drug testing. And again, if you have to undergo random drug testing, then you can take HCG because it's detectable for, let's say, 2 weeks. And that brings us to finding the ideal dose of HCG to sustain testicular function while using exogenous testosterone and perhaps other suppressive steroids or even SARMs, which has been investigated in the following study. Spoiler alert though, it's not 5,000 IUs 3 times weekly, it's not even 500 IUs 3 times weekly. The following study was performed by Coviello et al., published on May 2005, titled Low-Dose Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin Maintains Intratesticular Testosterone in Normal Men with Testosterone-Induced Gonadotropin Suppression. That's basically our kinds of people. In this study, 24 healthy adult men aged between 18 to 45 years old with normal hormone and fertility parameters received 200 milligrams testosterone enanthate intramuscularly weekly to suppress their gonadotropin levels, that being GnRH, gonadotropin hormone releasing hormone, LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. At the same time, these men also received either 125 IUs HCG, 250 IUs HCG, or 500 IUs HCG or placebo subcutaneously every other day of the week for a total treatment duration of 3 weeks. It's not mentioned what kind of brand of HCG they used and whether that was urine-purified or recombinant, but since this study is from 2005, it's highly likely that urine-purified HCG was used. The researchers analyzed blood work results at baseline and weekly during the 3-week treatment. Hormone and fertility parameters were rechecked 3 months after the treatment to ensure all men had a normally functioning hypothalamic pituitary testicular axis. Again, in order to assess intratesticular testosterone levels of the subjects, the researchers obtained testicular fluid through percutaneous aspiration, a needle straight into the ball sack. I mean, my stomach is just turning thinking about it, and my balls have completely retracted to the point where my kidneys are. They did this at baseline and after 3 weeks of treatment with testosterone enanthate and Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin. As you can see in figure 1, there was a dose-dependent and time-dependent increase in serum HCG levels, indicating that HCG builds up in serum with every other day administrations. But the researchers didn't always check serum HCG the day after the injection. On day 14 of the treatment, there was a 48 hours between the injection and drawing blood for analysis. Hence, there's a reduction in serum levels compared to day 7, right? You can clearly see this in figure 1. Testosterone enanthate plus placebo suppressed intratesticular testosterone levels by 94% at the end of the treatment. It decreased by 25% in the testosterone enanthate plus 125 IUs HCG group. It decreased by only 7% in the testosterone enanthate plus 250 IUs HCG group. And the only group in which intratesticular testosterone levels actually increased was the testosterone enanthate plus 500 IUs HCG group, which saw an increase of 26%. So we're going to have to find a middle ground to sustain intratesticular testosterone levels within normal parameters, unless this 26% is what you're after on top of your TRT dose. When you scroll down to figure 4a, you can clearly see that intratesticular testosterone levels only increased in the testosterone enanthate plus 500 IUs HCG group when compared to baseline readings. And in figure 2, you can see that testosterone enanthate plus either 250 IUs HCG or 500 IUs HCG, that the additional HCG at these high dosages was able to bring serum total testosterone levels to supraphysiological levels, whereas testosterone enanthate plus placebo, aka test E solo, or testosterone enanthate plus 125 IUs HCG, kept serum levels within normal parameters, albeit towards the top of the reference range. So what's the exact HCG dose to sustain intratesticular testosterone levels? Based on the results of this study, using some highly dubious extrapolated math, I would say that 280 IUs HCG every other day is the dose to go with. But if you want to go with injection convenience, inject 3 times weekly, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, then let's round that up to 325 IUs HCG instead. As further confirmation of the speculative dose of 325 IUs HCG 3 times per week, let's assess the dose-dependent response to HCG regarding serum estradiol levels. Besides testosterone synthesis and spermatogenesis, HCG will also stimulate estradiol production directly within the testicles. And even though you can use aromatase inhibitors to suppress the conversion of testosterone into estradiol, aromatase inhibitors aren't able to enter the testicles and directly inhibit estradiol synthesis locally. Aromatase inhibitors mostly work in other parts of the body, specifically adipose tissue. So if you have low body fat levels, but you still megadose, megablast the HCG, serum estradiol levels will still be sky freaking high. And as we saw in the high-dose studies, after a certain point, as HCG dosages escalate upwards, serum total testosterone levels don't really improve, but serum estradiol levels end up sky freaking high. So let's try to find out which dose of HCG gives you the highest testosterone levels. with minimal negative effect on your serum estradiol levels. This study is performed by Roth et al., published in August 2010, titled Dose-Dependent Increase in Intratesticular Testosterone by Very Low Dose Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin in Normal Men with Experimental Gonadotropin Deficiency. This study investigated hormonal response to various dosages of HCG at 15 IUs, 60 IUs, and 125 IUs subcutaneously every other day. And you see here in Table 1 that at 125 IUs HCG every other day, serum and intratesticular testosterone start to increase, but serum estradiol is a bit lower than baseline. The next study is performed by Padron et al., published in June 1980, so that's even older than the high-dose studies, but hey, we gotta work with what we have access to, right? Titled Prolonged Biphasic Response of Plasma Testosterone to Single Intramuscular Injection of Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin. This study is a little bit more applicable than the previous one. The researchers also investigated hormonal response to various dosages of HCG at 93.75 IUs, 375 IUs, 1500 IUs, and even 6000 IUs intramuscularly in a single injection, followed by multiple blood draws up until 144 hours or 6 days after the administration. And if you think that 93.75 IUs is very, very detailed, it's basically the same thing that I was doing when I split the Merck Ovitrol recombinant HCG 6500 IU serving in sixes. I got 1083 IUs per serving, right? So we have to keep it accurate for the sake of the community. After 16 hours, you see that serum total testosterone levels start to rise in all groups, but there's no steep response curve in the 375 IU group when compared to the 1500 IU group or the 6000 IU group. The 375 IU group ended up with a total testosterone level around 1000 nanograms per deciliter 48 hours after the single intramuscular administration. But I think with progressive administrations, let's say 3 times per week or every other day, serum total testosterone levels would slowly creep upwards as serum HCG levels seem to compound with consecutive administrations, as was shown in previous studies. Regarding estradiol levels, those start to increase within the first couple of hours after the administration, and in the 375 IU group, there was a steady increase ending up around 75 picograms per milliliter 96 hours after the injection, so the dose is probably already too high unless an aromatase inhibitor is used. And with consecutive administrations of 375 IUs, I'm sure serum estradiol levels would start to creep upwards also, right? If testosterone levels go up, then as these come down, in this coming down, it either converts into testosterone or estradiol. So there seems to be a little bit of a delayed response. Initially, total testosterone levels come up, and as testosterone comes down, serum estradiol levels come up, and with consecutive administrations, this would be worse. So I would say that 125 IUs is too little, and 375 IUs is too much, right, regarding serum estradiol levels. Moving over to another study performed by Smalls et al., published in February 1984, also freaking old, but very applicable for the guys who are still worried about desensitization, titled Differential Effect of Single High-Dose and Divided Small-Dose Administrations of Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin on Latex Cell Steroidogenic Desensitization. In this study, 7 healthy adult men aged between 18 to 45 years old received either 1500 IUs urine-purified HCG in a single dose intramuscularly or 300 IUs urine-purified HCG daily for 5 consecutive days. So that's also a total dose of 1500 IUs, also administered intramuscularly. Serum testosterone rose slower in the 300 IU HCG daily group compared to the 1500 IU group in a single administration, and ended up almost as high after 5 days of treatment. So even though the dose goes up initially slower, after 5 days of treatment, total testosterone levels are pretty much identical. But serum estradiol levels were significantly lower in the 300 IU daily group, indicating that smaller, more frequent injections are just as effective as high-dose bolus injections of HCG when it comes to your total testosterone levels, and smaller, more frequent injections are preferable to manage your serum estradiol levels and keep them more favorable, as you can clearly see from figure 1, that even though total testosterone ends up at very similar levels at, let's say, 1100 to 1200 nanograms per deciliter between the 1500 IUs intramuscularly in a single shot or spaced out over 4 days, you see that serum estradiol levels, instead of ending up at 80 picograms per milliliter in a single shot of 1500 IUs HCG, if you do that over 5 consecutive days, at the highest, you get a serum estradiol level of, let's say, 50 picograms per milliliter, which is certainly more favorable. Even though it's super physiological, most men can get away with a serum estradiol level around 50 picograms per milliliter. And if this total testosterone is, well, also super physiologic, I think on an HCG monotherapy of 300 IUs every single day, you feel pretty freaking good. And then the last study I want to highlight in this video, performed by Carlos Bonauser et al., published in August 2008, titled Evaluation of Endocrine Testing of Leydig Cells Function Using Extractive and Recombinant Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin and Different Doses of Recombinant Human Luteinizing Hormone in Normal Men. This study looked at the exponential dosage response curve using extracted, aka urine-purified Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin when either 50 IUs, 500 IUs, or 5,000 IUs HCG was administered to 8 healthy men aged between 18 to 30 years old. Here in Table 1, you see that the 500 IU HCG dose increased serum total testosterone levels by around 72% from the bottom to the middle of the reference range, but estradiol increased by 113% from the bottom middle of the reference range to the top of the reference range, which is very similar results to the previous studies using 500 IUs HCG or upwards. And when you look at figure 2, you can see that there's a linear response to the exponential dosage increase when it comes to serum total testosterone levels, which means diminishing returns as the dosage escalates upwards. But serum estradiol levels also increase at an exponential rate, meaning that there's a direct dose-dependent response to how much HCG you inject. Taking all of the scientific evidence into consideration, more frequent, albeit lower dosages around 300 IUs every other day or 3 times weekly seems to raise testosterone production and keep intratesticular testosterone levels sustained. Maybe serum concentrations might raise slightly, but not at the expense of increasing serum estradiol levels disproportionately. But let's say you add HCG to your existing TRT protocol consisting of 50 milligrams testosterone enanthate Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 150 milligrams per week, and in between those injections you take 300 IUs or 325 IUs HCG Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, then you're still going to have to put methods in place to control your serum estradiol levels, because the combination of exogenous testosterone and HCG at this effective dose will still send your estradiol levels to a point you're going to need to manage those with over-the-counter supplements or aromatase inhibitors like I discuss in these videos. So keep this in mind going forward. HCG monotherapy at 300 IUs 3 times per week might give you identical testosterone levels, but if you ramp up the dose higher, you will get supraphysiological testosterone levels. But as the dose escalates upwards, serum estradiol levels will increase disproportionately, forcing you to use an aromatase inhibitor or some sort of over-the-counter supplement to keep those estradiol levels suppressed. But when you combine HCG with TRT, you're going to need an aromatase inhibitor most likely, which brings us to the ideal dosing protocol of human-chorionic gonadotropin, whether that's urine-purified or recombinant. For men doing monotherapy, I would say 500 IUs to 1,000 IUs subcutaneous or intramuscularly 3 times weekly on Monday, Wednesday, Friday is the way to go. To sustain testicular function on cycle, the dose can be anywhere between 250 IUs to 500 IUs, but ideally that's 325 IUs subcutaneous or intramuscularly 3 times weekly in between your testosterone injections if you do that 3 times weekly, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday if you do that daily. The injections of the testosterone are daily, but the subcutaneous administrations of HCG can be 3 times weekly. The fertility dose on and off cycle is anywhere between 1,000 to 1,500 IUs subcutaneous or intramuscularly 3 times weekly, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or even daily. So some guys prefer 1,500 IUs HCG subcutaneous or intramuscularly daily to really bring their fertility parameters up to par on what they want them to be. Now, the deleterious dose is a little bit of an overstatement. It's simply because over 5,000 IUs 3 times weekly hasn't been investigated, or I couldn't find any clear scientific evidence that men were taking, let's say, 6,500 IUs 3 times weekly or 10,000 IUs HCG 3 times weekly. So I would prefer not to go over that, but at 5,000 IUs 3 times weekly, there were no clear signs of desensitization, and fertility parameters were slowly but steadily coming upwards, even alongside testosterone enanthate treatment. So because there's no scientific evidence, I would prefer anybody not to go over 5,000 IUs 3 times weekly. And I don't even think that that's a worthy experiment of running, because personally, I think your balls would be on fire running this much HCG. And regarding women, the only real practical application for women is to induce ovulation in which case it's either between 5,000 IUs to 10,000 IUs, urine-purified HCG, subcutaneous or intramuscularly, depending on how much adverse reactions these women get at the injection sites. Again, there is some impurities in urine-purified HCG, or stick with 6,500 IUs recombinant HCG subcutaneous in a single injection to induce ovulation. Again, recombinant HCG is where it's at, in my opinion, both for men and women. Now, this brings us to the final topic of this video, freezing your HCG to sustain it for longer periods of time after reconstitution, because, well, HCG is expensive and you don't want to waste half of your vial or 2/3 of your vial because it seems to denature over time. So freezing HCG has become somewhat of a niche practice in the TRT community because urine-purified HCG is, again, expensive, and sometimes the dosages from the compounding pharmacy are like 10,000 or 20,000 IUs per single vial, and you wouldn't be able to finish all of that if you stick with 250 IUs to 500 IUs 3 times weekly. As an example, if you mix 1 milliliter bacteriostatic water into a 5,000 IU HCG vial, then if you use 250 IUs HCG 3 times weekly, then it'll take about 6 weeks for you to go through this entire 5,000 IU vial. And if you would take 500 IUs HCG 3 times weekly, then it only takes 3 weeks. But like I mentioned before, after 2 weeks, it seems that the bioavailability and the potency comes down. Now, if you stick with 500 IUs 3 times weekly, the last week that you're taking HCG with the overlap of the HCG that you injected before, again, the half-life is about 24 to 33 hours with intramuscular or subcutaneous administrations, that means that you still get some overlap, and that the testicular shrinkage or the lack of libido and other fertility indicators are not really coming down. But if you do 250 IUs after the 2-week, 3-week mark, you will definitely start to notice that libido, semen volume, and testicular volume will go down simply because the HCG is slowly denaturing and the bioavailability is lost, which is in stark contrast to what the medical inserts always mention. They say that HCG remains potent, has high bioavailability, can be used for 30 days up to 60 days after reconstitution. But in practical application, it's usually 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, pushing it, but certainly not 60 days. That's well overstating it. And again, if you buy compounded HCG in 10,000 IUs or 20,000 IUs vials, then it will definitely not last 12 weeks or 24 weeks, right? Keep this in mind when you start shopping. And ever since HCG got listed as a biological a couple years back, it really seems that the purity and the potency of generic HCG has taken a nosedive. So when you get a 5,000 IU vial, is that really 5,000 IU or 1,000 IU? Maybe 2,000 IU, 2,500 IU if you're lucky. But then at best, if you're injecting 250 IU per serving, you get 125 IU, which was shown in the scientific evidence to be insufficient to raise intratesticular testosterone levels comparative to baseline or have some sort of positive effect on your total testosterone levels in serum, right? You need around 300 IUs 3 times weekly to sustain intratesticular testosterone levels and keep serum total testosterone levels favorable alongside TRT. So if you're only getting, half or a fifth of what you paid for, then it's very hard to dose the HCG. So still, you have to do your due diligence sourcing. And if you have a good source that presents in 5,000 IU HCG vials, you reconstitute the lyophilized urine-purified Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin in 1 milliliter bacteriostatic water. Then you transfer this 5,000 IUs either to 20 250 IU HCG insulin syringes or 10 500 IU HCG insulin syringes, and then you freeze it. Just make sure you draw in a little bit of air when you start freezing these insulin syringes with 250 IUs to 500 IUs HCG, because the problem with water, when you freeze it, it expands. So if you lay them flat, then some of this water is going to expand outwards through the needle into the needle cap, and now you're losing precious HCG, right? You won't be able to inject that. That is now lost to the winds. So you need to make sure that the insulin syringes are upright. You draw in a little bit of air. It can be 0.1 milliliter or 10 IUs on the insulin syringe. You freeze them facing upwards. You can put them all in a plastic cup with the needle pointing upwards. And now as the water is freezing with the HCG contained within, the water is not expanding to the point it starts leaking out of the tip, right? So you're not losing any HCG in this process. Then you freeze maybe an hour before you're ready to use it. You take it out of the freezer, it thaws on the kitchen countertop or your injection desk, wherever you prefer, and then you inject it. it doesn't seem to be a problem. Anecdotally, many people in the TRT community have preserved their urine-purified HCG in this way, and the bioavailability and the potency is still 100% as the same as when they reconstituted a new vial. And again, there's no real scientific evidence to support this. I couldn't find anything on PubMed, Science Direct, Google Scholar, or other publication websites where HCG is frozen and then thawed and the bioavailability is still exactly the same, but plenty of anecdotal reports in the fitness community, in the TRT community, to back this up. But I've frozen and thawed Merck Sharp & Dome urine-purified HCG MSD Pregnil through 5 cycles, injected that, checked my beta HCG levels in a serum test using blood work, and the levels came back exactly where you would expect them to be, and it will still detect on a pregnancy test, which is obviously looking for urinary HCG. And the reason why this works on paper is because the amino acid structure of Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin is hydrophobic on the inside, where the alpha and beta subunits connect. It repels water. So water is not able to enter the amino acid structure, not within the molecule of HCG, whereas the outside of HCG is hydrophilic, allowing it to be dissolved in water, allowing it to be carried through the bloodstream, right? The blood is water, or mostly water, after all. But if water can't enter the hydrophobic HCG molecule, then it can't crystallize within the HCG molecule, otherwise tearing it apart, right? Water expands as it's frozen. So in this context, the water is only surrounding the HCG, and as it's frozen, even though it's expanding, it will expand proportionally into the rest of the water, into the rest of the insulin syringe, but the hydrophobic HCG molecule remains intact. And to further confirm this idea, pharmaceutical Iplex, which is IGF-1 bound to IGF binding protein 3, is also shipped frozen. IGF binding protein 3 is also hydrophobic on the inside. This is where the IGF-1 is attached, but it's hydrophilic on the outside, allowing it, after thawing, allowing it to be transported through the bloodstream and then release the IGF-1 into the bloodstream where it can interact with the IGF-1 receptors. And NAD+ nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide is often also shipped frozen, as it has several hydrophobic domains on the outside of the molecule, even though it's highly soluble in water once thawed. And the lyophilization process is a freeze-drying process where the HCG solution is sprayed into a 1 milliliter or 2 milliliter vial. This occurs under vacuum, and as the water evaporates, it's frozen, and now these water crystals are removed from the vial, leaving a small lyophilized puck at the bottom of the vial. And this is what you then ultimately reconstitute with bacteriostatic water, returning the HCG into a solution. So technically, it should be okay to freeze and thaw small servings of urine-purified Human-Chorionic Gonadotropin to preserve the potency, but I still wouldn't recommend it because the purity of urine-purified HCG is subpar compared to recombinant HCG, which remains potent for up to 30 days after first use of this recombinant HCG pen or syringe. And at 250 IUs 3 times weekly, you'll go through a 6,500 IU Merck Ovitrol HCG pen in about 8 weeks or 60 days. So you might lose a little bit of potency from the second month onwards, even though I've never noticed that. If I take 250 IUs, whether that's at the start of opening up a new pen of recombinant HCG or at the end, 60 days later, beta HCG levels still detect exactly the same as at the start. So I feel that you don't lose any potency with recombinant HCG, again, because these pens or syringes are self-sealing, and you'll go through the 6,500 IUs in about 4 weeks if you stick with 500 IUs HCG 3 times weekly. So that's well within the recommendation of finishing the Merck Ovitrol recombinant HCG within 30 days of first use. Oh, and by the way, the medical insert of Merck Ovitrol recombinant HCG does clearly mention that you shouldn't freeze recombinant HCG, and this is also clearly mentioned in some, but not all, of the medical inserts of urine-purified pharmaceutical HCG brands. I'd keep this in mind. I don't think that it's a good idea to freeze HCG, even though technically on paper it should be a viable option, as has been confirmed by many anecdotal reports in the TRT and fitness community. But I would stick with recombinant HCG instead and just inject 500 IUs to get a little bit of boost in total testosterone levels on top of your TRT with manageable estradiol production, which again, you might need to resolve with over-the-counter supplements or aromatase inhibitors. Well, and if you still can't piece it together after watching the entirety of this video, I'm always available for consultations. I can help you dial in your TRT, HRT, or full-blown steroid cycle with a little bit of HCG alongside of it for normal testicular function, good spermatogenesis, so you can get your partner pregnant a little bit later on in life, even if you're not thinking about doing that right now. Do your blood work over at Merck Health if you live in the United States. They also have excellent healthcare providers and patient care coordinators who can help you interpret your blood work result and dial in your TRT, HRT with HCG alongside of that. You can find everything that I'm associated with down below in the YouTube description section. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Vigorous Steve, Vigorous Crew. You guys know what to do. A 500 IU's recombinant HCG frontable bicep in your face. I don't expect these kinds of gains. You still need to take a little bit of steroids on top of that and maybe growth hormone, Increlex, and insulin. But at least my testicles are nice and full. You can bet all of your testicles on that fact. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.